Blast from the past, but we're here to make it last. Stay the meta, prepared to take on the task. Stuffing you with data, filling you up like a cushion. Dropping with no restraint, because we're meant to keep you pushing.
It only matters if it ladders. Comment below as we kick off the new year by walking through Week 8 of Foundation Standard. Alrighty, folks. I went through 25 major tournaments this past weekend, looking at everything from Spotlight Atlanta to local RCQs and back. Out of that, Gruul Aggro finished at the top with a whopping 40 top 8s and 5 trophies, including Spotlight Atlanta. That means out of 200 top 8 slots, Gruul had 20% of them, and out of those 25 trophies, Gruul had 20% of those as well. That is a dominant performance from the archetype, and I'm sure it surprises nobody when I say the Rebellion also chose to bring this deck to Atlanta and placed 5 members in the top 200 of that 1,400 player tournament with it. For those that are interested, we have a full sideboard guide available to our Coffee and Grinders members.
Oh yeah. Now next on the list is Dimir Aggro, managing to take 32 top 8s and 5 trophies of its own. Even with everyone gunning for this archetype, it still managed to push through and perform, which really speaks to how difficult it will be to take down Dimir moving forward.
Coming in third was Esper Pixie, enjoying its breakout performance this past weekend with 25 top 8s and 3 trophies of its own. Now, I wouldn't expect this specific build to continue much longer. This is a perfect origin point for those looking to evolve the archetype further, though.
For sure. Rounding out Tier 1 is Simic Spells, with 7 top 8s and 3 trophies. Now, while this may seem like a sharp decline, this deck nonetheless took down a couple of major tournaments at a pretty high conversion rate.
Kicking off Tier 2, we have Mono Red Aggro posting 13 top 8s and a single trophy this past weekend as it struggled to find a place with all the Gruul Aggro and hate for Gruul Aggro that was running around.
No doubt. In 6th place is Mono White Control, managing 9 top 8s and a single trophy of its own while keeping the stock price of Beza sky high. Now, whether this deck will find a way through the diversified threat base in Tier 1 remains to be seen, but we know it can be hard hedged to trample Dimir all day.
Azorius Oculus made it to 7th place with 6 top 8s and 2 trophies, though none of these builds have addressed the looming issue of how to evolve through Grave Hate. Much like Dredge and Vintage, the current build shines when Graveyard Hate is missing from sideboards.
Yeah. Now, last but not least, Zer's Domain managing to snag 8th place with 13 top 8s, but not a single trophy to its name. Nonetheless, a copy of this deck made it to the semifinals of Spotlight Atlanta, and the numbers tell a tale of an archetype that's slowly adjusting.
Over in Brewer's Corner, I'll be covering Omniscience Combo and Rakdos Pact, each of which made top 8s at major tournaments this past weekend.
And I'll be highlighting Temur and Jund Ramp, 2 unconventional archetypes looking to find a path through this unyielding wall of aggro. Now let's kick off our archetype breakdowns, Tier 1 with Gruul Aggro.
Apologies if I butcher the name. Nicholas Odenheimer took down Spotlight Atlanta with Gruul Aggro, a 1,400 plus player event, and let's dive into why this build worked so well. It is the return of Leyline, and I know nobody's that happy to see it outside of Nicholas, because, well, it's Leyline. This deck, though, I like the way that they positioned it. There are 6 protection spells in the main in a removal-heavy format. That seems spicy. You've got the 4 druids to allow you to grind through all that as well, which is probably necessary at this point for aggro. Like, you cannot go 1-for-1 with aggro and expect to win against all these black-based mid-range decks that are just launching removal spells left and right at you. You're going to need to grind, and druid here is a clear sign that this person understood that. Now, 4 Slick Shot is back, and there's only 8 mice in this build. So we've eschewed the Manifold Mouse scenario, and we've said, nope, we've got enough ways to trigger Valiant. We don't need the mouse. We're just going to push through, and we're going to go get to the sky, use Slick Shot, get through there. There's also Paw Patch Recruits as a 4 of in the sideboard to grind even harder against those mid-range decks that are trying to remove everything in sight, and I love where that's positioned as well.
Okay. Now, I see, right, no Manifold Mouse. Manifold Mouse being just a huge part of our game plan when we went to Spotlight Atlanta. But, you're not getting Manifold Mouse to grow the Heartfires, the Ember Hearts, getting extra cards off the top. I'm not seeing Nemesis. I do see Sellsword. I do see Snakeskin Veil. Are these cards worth those slots? How do you feel about this transition?
I'm nervous with Esper Pixie coming up. You start seeing all these decks with 4 copies of Nowhere to Run, and Snakeskin Veil gets a lot worse. But But specifically in this build, where you have Leyline, which is going to copy that snakeskin, you can grow creatures above the -3/-3 of Nowhere to Run with it. So perhaps it's not as much of a problem in that scenario. And perhaps that's why it's worth giving up those slots, because this deck screams, I'm going to do all of the momentous things. And the fact that it can put you in that catch-22 where it goes, okay, it's your turn. At the end of your turn, you know there's a questing druid coming. And when it comes, is it going to just allow Slickshot to blow through everything? Or is it going to be just a slow build of resources? You know, like it does such a good job of grinding and putting your opponent in that catch-22 of like, do I need to hold up removal at the end of every turn, you know, before questing druid ruins me on the next turn? Or do I need to be advancing the board state? So I like where this is positioned on that front, but it is hard for me to say Manifold Mouse isn't the right call right now.
Yeah, and I saw those overprotects as well in there, and that kind of gives a hint as to what the game plan is here, right? To outgrow the Nowhere to Run. So, yeah, I can definitely see what you're saying. Let's move on to the next deck with a huge target on its back, of course, Dimir Aggro.
Akshay Karthik took down a 251-player ReCQ at SCG Con in Atlanta this past weekend with Dimir midrange, and let's look at how they position this list. Now, first and foremost, I love how simplistic they went. There are so many 4-ofs and 2-ofs in this list. They knew what they wanted to be doing, and they hedged it properly, right? So you've got the 4 cut down in the main. We're hedging against aggro. We're hedging against the mirror. We're saying you have to kill the turn 1 play, and I think that's an acknowledgement that needed to be made. I also like that there's a 4-4 split of Curiosity and Kaido, and this build of the deck is saying we are the tempo. We are going to live and die on tempo. The Fabloom tricks are a nice hedge for the mirror in the main. That's spicy. Same with Sheoldred's Edict. That does a good job there, and it also does a pretty decent job when we're working against all these snakeskin veils, right? The ability to just go, nope, sack the creature anyway. That Slickshot's not making it through. Now, what I love is that you get to the sideboard, and you get the 2 Gixes, the 2 Preachers, the 2 Shellies, the 2 Anoints, and the Stab. That is a lot of anti-aggro that you get to use in the sideboard to shore up that matchup, while saying the main board is going to be primarily positioned against the rest of the format. You can still take game 1 against aggro with this, but I don't think it's going to be as common. But post-board, you should be favored with what they're trying to do here, and I like that.
I guess that kind of leads into my question. I see the Anoint with Afflictions in the sideboard. What happened to the main board? Nowhere to Runs, the main board Anoint with Afflictions we were seeing. Is it just giving up game 1 for a good post-board game plan? What's going on here?
I think it's acknowledging that Nowhere to Run is great in those pixie decks, but less so if you're not going to be bouncing it back and forth to your hand. If you're not going to get additional value out of it, it can be very awkward at times. And the Gruul decks, other than the Leyline one that you saw, and that was the only copy of that deck that went far this past weekend, right? All the other ones, they're not on Leyline. So they're not really on Snakeskin Veil, which means you don't need Nowhere to Run as much now. But Anoint with Afflictions off the sideboard, I love, because it also gives you points against Oculus, which I think is key. You know, like, Oculus is a better deck than a lot of people think it is. And I expect to see it start to make a surge in the next month or so.
Okay. You heard it here first, folks. But let's talk about really the rising star of the latest set of events. Let's talk about Esper Pixie.
Fabian Rogachnig took down a 36-player RCQ in Austria this past weekend with Esper Pixie, cementing a meteoric rise from relative obscurity for this archetype. So let's dive into where they went with this. First and foremost, you're going to see those 4 copies of Nowhere to Run. You got to love that when you've got Pixies to bounce them back, when you've got Fears to bounce them back. You are just getting value town on this. And speaking of towns, this town ain't big enough. That engine from Otters with Stormchaser's talent just got thrown into here. And I think this deck is it's an evolution, Max. You're taking the best parts of Otters, you're taking some of the best parts of these Enchantress decks, and you're smashing them together and saying, we can get value. We can play a high synergy deck that doesn't necessarily have individual card power level that's very impressive, but this deck puts on a lot of pressure quickly, and it does it with cards that you'd see in a draft. You know, like Fear of Isolation you look at, and it doesn't look that impressive. But when you go Hopeless Nightmare, Fear, Hopeless Nightmare, you've dealt 4 points, taken out 2 cards, and you've got a 2/3 flyer that just sits there. And again, all these bounce spells just value town, value town, value town. And when you add in a card like Entity Tracker, you've got a draw engine on top of that. So I think if you can tear this deck apart, you have to tear it apart on the back of disrupting the synergy, because the individual cards aren't what you're trying to answer. It's the overarching strategy.
I agree. This archetype seems really interesting in light of all the aggro that we're seeing right now. But I just have to ask, 2 copies of Sheltered by Ghosts. Why not 4? What's going on there?
I'm going to assume that this individual did enough testing to realize that Sheltered by Ghosts is great right until red decks start running Lithomantic against a blue-white deck, and then it's a problem. You do not want to get 2-for-1 with Sheltered by Ghosts, and this is a deck that will happen to when the red decks are playing Lithomantics. And I mean, we were in Atlanta, Max. We played 4 Lithomantics in our sideboard because we kept testing and we kept seeing target after target that we needed to kill, and it did it for 1 mana uncounterably, pushing through everything. And it paid off. I know that paid off for a lot of us. So I expect red to be on Lithomantics. I think it's foolish if you're not on 4 after this weekend. And because of that, Sheltered by Ghost starts to step to the wayside again in many decks because they're putting it on a blue or white creature, which it isn't going to last.
Expect a barrage of barrage. But talking about another deck in Value Town, definitely lives there. Maybe the mayor. Let's talk about Simic Spells.
Colin Mulally took down a 262-player ReCQ at SCG Con in Atlanta this past weekend with Simic Spells, keeping the list in Tier 1 territory for another week as we examine where it's evolving. Now, Max, I don't think the main has changed that much. I think it's pretty well set at this point, in fact. We're going to see the same stuff, right? This town's big fat serpents, big fat crabs up the beanstalks, and then a whole lot of 1-mana spells that are going to enable these to get into play around turn 3 or 4, depending on how fast your draw is, and just the value engine of Storm Chasers in this town. That's all well established. You get to the sideboard, though, this is where the individual got very spicy. The 1 Basilisk Collar. I love this. I love where this is positioned. The ability to just dump this onto a 5/5 and swing like it's a Baneslayer Angel seems amazing against aggro. I also love that we're on these 2 Glissas. The fact that these can grind so efficiently for you, and they also give you a little extra reach against some of those mono-white enchantment heavy decks, against even Pixie if they're going to board out the Nowhere to Runs, which frankly they should be against all these 5/5s. So I think it's just really well sideboarded, and that's going to be what makes this the next evolution.
All right, all right. Speaking of the sideboard, I do see the 1 Keen-Eyed Curator in there, one of my personal favorite cards. Can you tell me how you feel about, where this card is positioned versus something similar like Scavenging Ooze when it comes to graveyard hate?
I think it depends on how much green mana you have access to versus, how much you're going to be splashing into other colors. And that's a big part of Ooze versus Keen-Eyed, because Keen-Eye's going to require the double green up front, which isn't that hard for this deck, but Ooze is going to require you to want 3 or 4 green mana if you're trying to constantly filter against other graveyard decks, whereas this one just says as much mana as you've got, dump it in the moment it hits. There's also the fact that Keen-Eyed, in a deck that has this many types of permanents, does a really good impression of becoming a 7/7 and breaking through. So I'm not sure that I love it, but I think the individual here knew what they were doing with it. So give it another week or 2. Let's see if it pans out. It might just be a flex slot that they're testing out. It might be the real deal, but I don't think we can say for sure either way at this point.
Yeah, we're going to have to see how this deck transition and evolves over the next few weeks. But that does it for all our Tier 1 archetypes. And I'm excited to kick off Tier 2 by talking about Mono Red Aggro. Nick Turnbull took down an 81-player ReCQ in Atlanta this past weekend with Mono Red Aggro. So let's look at what they did with this particular version of the list. A clear signifier of what this list wants to do is the fact that you've got 8 burn spells in the main. This is a very get 'em dead red, in your face kind of deck. We do have the full mouse package. I just want to say, very simplistic design here. I like how simple it is to build. I like that it knows what it wants to do. So mouse package, hired claws, monastery swift spears. There's nothing really new to sing about here, but it is a very straightforward game plan when you put it all together. And it does do its job pretty consistently of getting underneath all of the other decks. Frenzy in the main over Scorching Shot has kind of been a debate. I think I like Frenzy because, of course, you have the instant speed, critical early game removal, getting rid of your Sheldras, getting rid of your Glissas. 3-drop slot is pretty heavy with a lot of stuff that you want to get rid of in the opposing decks, and I think Frenzy does a good job of that. Litho Barrage, we were just talking about Litho Barrage, putting in a lot of work against other archetypes. I mean, you think about Oculus, Domain, Mono White Control, just to name a few. Anything running Sheltered by Ghosts, like we just said, Litho Barrage, you definitely want a full set in the sideboard.
So, Max, I look at this list and I ask, do we still want Twisted Fealty in the sideboard? And I'm only asking because Unholy Annex is gone for the most part. Arcfiends of the Dross are gone. Do we still need that treason spell?
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough to argue for the spell, post annex, but this deck knows what it wants to do. It wants to be a fast-paced, get 'em dead kind of red deck. I think this card is very unique in the fact that it not only removes a hurdle, like Sheltered by Ghosts often does, but it does a little bit more, right? It pushes just a bit more damage, which is what this deck wants to do. It synergizes really well with it, and it's a really great way to close out the game. Still the opposing Sheldred, still the opposing Overlord, and do damage with it. It puts your opponent in a tough spot. It's just a great way to close out games, in my opinion.
I mean, that's a fair point. And regardless of whether it's a Shelly or an Arcfiend, if you get them dead, you get them dead, right? So that's a fair
Absolutely.
point. But let's go to a deck that doesn't want to get them dead fast. It wants to grind probably forever. Mono white control.
All right, Mono White Control, Lavunga 21. With this iteration, smashed through a 65-player MTGO challenge this past weekend, proving that Mono White still has room to maneuver in this meta. And here's why. Look, we have a pretty stock list right here. There's not too much new to talk about, except for the fact that instead of going with a 2-4 or 4-2 split, we're doing the full 4-4 talents and innocence. And that just shows that, of course, this deck wants to grind much like Mono Red. It knows what it wants to do, even if it's the opposite kind of strategy. We're also seeing a little signifier of the aggro heavy meta that we're in with the 4 copies of Beza, especially against your red-based Gruul, your red-based aggro. The life gain is important in those matchups. I think Beza putting bodies on the board and giving you life is very critical. That's why we're seeing a full set here. The return of Archangel Elspeth as well to the main. 1 copy of. This card is frustrating. It puts bodies on the boards, it adds life gain, and it gives you another target for the red-based decks to go after. Do they delay themselves a turn attacking it? It's always a choice. And I think, honestly, we're going to continue to see the 4 consoles in the sideboard. Authority of the Consoles just putting in work against aggro, making cards like Forge obsolete. So definitely a reason why we're going to continue to see that card in white-based sideboards everywhere.
Fair. Now, I look at this mono white list, Max, and I'm seeing 4 Sunfalls. Is that too slow right now? Do we want more split up in the main, or can we afford to wait till turn 5?
This was a question that we encountered in our testing, right, when we were still trying to figure out which deck to play. Look, I think 5 mana value might be a bit too slow for this meta. I do agree there. I'm unsure that we want to replace those with Split Up. I like Split Up as a sideboard game plan, especially when you pair it with Authority of the Consoles. But maybe we hedge some of that with Day of Judgment. A couple copies of Day of Judgment instead. I think 4 mana value makes a huge difference, especially in a very fast-paced standard meta. We've already got Smite, which can take out your Enduring cards, your Vitalities, your Curiosities. Other than that, you're worried about like the Enduring cards with the Destroy effect on your board wipes. Sunfall is great for the exile, right? But you still have answers to some of those things that stick around. So I think Day of Judgment is not a bad alternative, honestly. There's still good exile-based removal for your Oculus decks. So in the future, I'm going to go ahead and guess that we're probably going to see a little bit of a split between Sunfall and Day of Judgment for this archetype.
And that's fair. I mean, we've got a ton of Wraths to consider in white. And it really just depends where you want to be on the curve and what are you trying to get rid of as to what you want to play week to week. And Day of Judgment's, it's still Wrath of God. You know what I mean? Wrath of God has always been decent in standard, so I doubt it's classic bad at this point. Right?
Yeah.
But let's move to something that's a little less classic. The Eye in the Sky, Azorius Oculus.
Oh man, Azorius Oculus. Dig this archetype. So many ways to build it, but Karate Dom snagged a trophy in Sunday's 70-player MTGO challenge with this deck, making this the next evolution in the archetype. Let's talk about it. I just want to say right off the bat, I don't know exactly how I feel about this build with the 22 2-drops. I feel like that's a little burdensome for the 2 mana value slot. We're not seeing Opt. We're not seeing Sleight of Hand. That, I don't know. That's kind of a choice. I'm not sure how I feel about it, especially with the way that we tested. But nonetheless, we've got some other choices here to discuss. Negate over Disdainful Stroke. You can kind of tell that Gruul Aggro is at the top of the meta with the target on its back. You want Negate in some cases over Disdainful Stroke. We're not seeing as much Xur Domain dominate, right? So I don't know. That's definitely a question that's debatable. We've got a 4-3 split between Helping Hand to Recommission, really signifying how much this iteration of the deck relies on graveyard play. So that, I mean, I don't know. We'll discuss that in just a minute here because I think this deck also, I have to discuss really quickly, it also relies on founding the third path. Again, another 2 mana value card. So these are choices that this iteration made. I personally would have gone a different direction with the deck.
Let's talk about the other direction we could go, because I think you're right insofar as this list works really well until you start seeing like rest in pieces off the sideboard, and then it just cries. So if this list only works until opponents emphasize that graveyard hate, where do you go, Max? Where do you evolve?
So something that, and I'll credit Athena the Bund for making this argument over the course of, the time that we were testing. I think Drakecatcher is a really good addition to the deck that a lot of people, even in the spotlight, really didn't consider, really didn't plan for. Drakecatcher gives you a really unique plan B. It really allows you to do something other than, get graveyard hated out. You don't have to include so many copies of Helping Hand and Recommission in your main to rely on the graveyard play. You can kind of sideboard in those recommissions, for example. So Drakecatcher, sometimes just a Drakecatcher on the board can dominate a matchup if you play it correctly. I also think you have to pair the Drakecatcher with a lot of these 1 mana value instants and sorceries that we were talking about, like Opt and Sleight of Hand. So and then there's also the added bonus. If you're playing Recommission, it can make your Oculus go above Lithomanic Barrage. So it's, if you play it that way, if you push the recommissions to the sideboard, bring in Drakecatcher, play the 1 mana value cards, I think you really hedge for the graveyard hate game plan that you are kind of starting to see in sideboards everywhere. So I think that's the direction that, Athena, I'll credit Athena the Bun for that. But yeah, that's kind of the direction I would go in.
And you bring up an interesting point with the recommissions, being able to get around Lithomantic by making your Oculus a 6/6, but also just making them able to block, which is kind of a key facet against red decks where you're able to go, here's a 6/6 and a 2/2, good luck. Instead of saying, here's a 5/5 you're going to kill with a Lithomantic, and a 2/2 you're going to run right through. So I can see where recommission gains points here. But yeah, I'm with you on the Drakecatcher. I think it's very underexplored right now. Athena the Bun did an incredible job figuring that out in our testing. And I'm really curious to see where the archetype evolves with that in mind. But we're going to move it right along and talk about Xur's Domain.
Xur's Domain. So Xur and friends may not have actually won a tournament this past weekend. They were definitely present. Gray Pain, with this iteration, made it to the semifinals of Spotlight Atlanta. I mean, in a 1,500 player field, that's an accomplishment with the following list. So let's talk about it. We've got main board 2/3 Smite to Get Lost split here for the early aggro in the main, and I keep bringing that up. When we talk about it main, I keep bringing up the matchup against aggro because that's really its weakest point. So the more that you can sort of hedge against that matchup, the better. We do have 1 copy of Day of Judgment here, 1 Beza, both in the 4 mana value slot, and you're not seeing a very heavy 4 mana value slot because you really just want to play the White Overlord in that slot. One thing that I've been questioning week after week, and I'm going to continue to question, is why people are playing the Blue Overlord over the red. This is a 4 of Beans deck. I do think you have the card draw advantage here, especially when you play Beans into the Green Overlord, which is really what you want to do on turn 3. I mean, I was talking with a lot of different players over the weekend in Spotlight, and we all kind of agreed if Domain doesn't play the Green Overlord on 3, it's kind of dead, especially when you're looking at a heavy aggro meta. So I don't know. I'd shift a few of those slots, but I do like the way this deck is evolving to hedge against aggro.
So when you look at the Blue Overlord, do you think it's going to make the cut in the end, or do you think it's just superfluous at this point for value?
Yeah, you know how I feel about this. I think it is a little bit superfluous for the value. I think this deck still kind of dies to aggro 50-50, right? Maybe even worse than that. That matchup could honestly use the game 1 victory. So I think, playing Green Overlord on 3, that is what you want to do, but it doesn't win the matchup. You really want to do something else. I think Day of Judgment could step in. I think Split Up could step in. I don't know. I feel like this deck is still just a little bit too weak to aggro, and it shows in the results. So, yeah, I think Blue Overlord for something like Split Up, Day of Judgment, it just needs to move more in that direction.
That's a fair argument. It's a fair argument. I mean, you gotta beat aggro, and we've seen how dominant Gruul has been lately. So, alrighty. With that said, we're gonna move things right along and get to my favorite segment every week, Max, Brewer's Corner. Let's go ahead and kick things off. Max, tell us about Temur Ramp.
Sanity not included. Love the name, by the way. Top 8 at a Queue at SCGCon Atlanta. I mean, that's awesome. This list, if I could summarize it, is basically an aggressive ramp list, right? It uses cornucopia, but this list is a little bit more aggressive than your typical cornucopia list that you see out there. So, Wandertail Mentor, card I want to highlight. This card can outgrow the eventual board wipe that you're playing in this deck, and that board wipe is Ill-Timed Explosion, one of my favorite board wipes, especially in a ramp style deck. One card that I want to highlight that doesn't see any play, you might have even forgotten it was in Standard, is Volcanic Spite. 3 damage, right? But it's also going to help you fix a little bit, help you find your next land drop, for example. Very important in a ramp deck. Cornucopia, good in this meta, especially in aggro-heavy meta where life gain helps a lot. I mean, it helps you outpace the red-based aggro, the Gruul-based aggro. So any deck you can use Cornucopia in, awesome. The life gain definitely tallies after a while. And then on the top end here, we've got Bonnie Paul, we've got Doppelgang, we've got the Star Enthusiast here dropping meteorites on you. Really nice top end, classic top end for the Temur ramp list. So, credit to Sandy Not Included for running something a little bit unorthodox and catching people by surprise.
Honestly, Max, looking at that creature base, I just want to call it Temur Trash Panda. So, that's my vote for renaming it.
I dig it.
Anyway, we're going to move along and talk a little bit about Omniscience combo. Alrighty, so credit to Canapes16, one of 2 players to win a trophy with this. 2 of 2. It converted at 100%, and this was at a 42-player MTGO challenge this past weekend. So, how does this deck work? Well, it's all about using Abuelo's Awakening to pull back Omniscience, and that's the goal of the whole deck, is just can we grab Omniscience and then start casting everything for free. And when we can do that, this deck can do just about anything, right? So I love where this is positioned. It's very spicy to me. I've not seen an Omniscience combo in Standard in a really long time, and I've barely seen it in the Eternal formats for it's Sneak and Show. That's about it, right? And otherwise, it's just not around. So I don't know. This is such a wild list to me with what it's trying to do, but I'm in for Omniscience. I'm always in to try out an Omniscience deck. It's just been too long since I've been able to cast everything for free.
Yeah. We're not quite in a lame duck period like we usually are when a set's about to release, right? Because Foundation is going to be out for 5 years, so these cards aren't going anywhere. But it's like in these sort of in-between time periods, it's interesting to see what rises to the top, what wins events by surprise. And Omniscience combo, who would have thought?
Right? Oh, my God. I love that it got 2 first places. Everybody now has to acknowledge it's a real archetype and try and figure out what the hell to do against Omniscience again. And all these decks are sitting there like, we don't play counterspells because Red exists and Pixie exists. And Dimir, it's not good against Duress. And then Omniscience is like, cool, you don't play counterspells. I guess we'll just do the biggest, dumbest thing as fast as we can. And it's efficient at that. It's efficient at that. But we're going to move things right along and talk about a very weird list that did well recently. Max, tell us about Jund Ramp.
Love all these unique archetypes that we're showing off. Zachary Fleischer, top 8 in RCQ at SCGCon in Atlanta with Jund Ramp. If I could summarize this deck, I would say it's a little bit like your Golgari-based ramp, but you've got 4 each of the red and green overlords. I love the red overlord, by the way. Just, so much damage over time. But 8 pieces of standard basic removal that you're going to see in the first couple slots with the addition of Maelstrom Pulse and Terra Sunder. I mean, this removal base is definitely nothing to gawk at. I mean, it's going to do what it needs to do against the aggro-based decks. We've also got Deadly Cover-Up in here. We've got copies of Harvester of Misery. I mean, these cards really do clean up against aggro, especially your red aggro, your Gruul aggro. So I feel like this deck, because of these sorts of board wipes, is well positioned. Also, the reliance on 4 copies of Herd Migration. Even Zer's Domain isn't doing that anymore. And the life gain off this, being able to ramp with this, and it's a great top-end card. I mean, my God, definitely utilize your Herd Migrations. And I just want to sing the praises of this card that doesn't get much play. 3 copies of Scrap Shooter in the sideboard. Who's playing Scrap Shooter, and why aren't you? I mean, Artifact and Enchantment hate. 4/4 body for 3. It's with reach. I mean, it's amazing. Play your Scrap Shooters if you can.
Fair. And I love that this list in particular, Max, said, okay, it's like Golgari Ramp, but what if we added red for Torch, Pyroclasm, and Overlord? What if we just had a little bit better early removal and then also a big fat Overlord that is largely underexplored at this point because it's in red, and red is not really a control color these days. But Either way, we've got one more here in Brewer's Corner. Let's take a look at Rakdos pack. Okay, so for those who are unaware, there are two different combos sitting in this deck, right? First and foremost, you get to Demonic Pact, you make it to the point where it's about to go, you lose the game, it's the only one that hasn't been chosen, and then you use this cute little cat to hand it to your opponent so that they lose the game on their upkeep, right? That's the first combo. The second one, and this is kind of fun, is they're doing Greed's Gambit, where they play it, draw 3, gain 6, create 3. You're probably going to have the first end step hit you, and then the next time you just go Harmless Offering, now you have Greed's Gambit, and now every single turn they're discarding a card, losing 2 life, and sacrificing a creature. It's not too shabby. Now, the reason you have Beseech the Mirror in this is, one, because it combos beautifully with Greed's Gambit, where you get all these tokens that you can sacrifice as a bargain, but also because it gives you the ability to go search for these Harmless Offerings or whichever combo piece you're missing. Similarly, you see the case of the Stashed Skeleton allowing you to do a Demonic Tutor scenario as the game goes on. So I mean, it feels very Glass Cannon, and Demonic Pact feels a little slow, but, credit to Zalard Beret. They top-aided the ReCQ at SCG Con in Atlanta with this, so clearly their opponents were sitting there scratching their heads going, I have no idea how the hell to stop this combo. And, well, that's how it goes sometimes, right?
Oh my gosh, that's wild. The whole deck reminds me of that 3-mana, I forget the name, but the Thieving Goblin that would drop an artifact on the opponent's board and it would do damage to them every turn for that artifact. It's just like, here you go. I'm just going to drop bombs on your side. I love it.
You
I
get
love it so
permanents.
much.
They're not really gifts, though. Alrighty.
Oh, man.
And that's going to bring us to our final segment, Ahead of the Curve. Now, Max, we looked at 12 archetypes in our recap. What are you playing going into Week 9 of Foundation Standard?
So I'm going to play one of the decks I got to test for the Spotlight. Let's talk about Jeskai Convoke. I just have to say, when this deck runs hot, it runs super hot. I mean, me and Cody and several other players on the team were talking about how this is just a casino slots deck, right? And why not? I mean, it's a lot of fun to play. We've still got the 4 copies of Sheltered by Ghosts in here. I mean, this card, in a fast-paced, go-wide game plan, we're trying to win by turn 3, turn 4. Sheltered by Ghosts isn't that bad. And it provides much-needed life gain in the face of red-based aggro, and it's a way to really get rid of the one hurdle that you need to get rid of, your Glissas, your Sheldreds, what have you. 2 copies of Warrior's Call. I think Warrior's Call is a must in Convoke. I mean, not only does it boost all your creatures, but it also provides a way for you to do damage when you play your Gleeful Demolitions, when you go super wide with your Knight Errants. Warrior's Call is a way to win, and that's how I think of it. A couple of copies of Mockingbird also feels right. I've seen some decks with up to 4. It just feels like it runs out of targets when you have 4, especially if you draw it early. But being able to copy your artifact creating creatures, being able to copy your Sirens, being able to, Gleeful Demolition again, or for the first time if you failed the first time, really helpful. But also, there's a wide array of colorful targets to copy, like Oculus, for example, that you can do to the opponent. So don't overlook the Mockingbird in your Jeskai Convoke builds.
I'll be honest, Max, I actually really love this build because it has such moxie. Like, it sits there and it goes, you better have the answer right now, or else this game's over. And it just does that over and over again. And, like, yeah, if they've got it, they've got it. But if they don't, they're getting run the hell over. And Convoke, this build in particular, I think it has a lot to offer on that front. And I'm with you on Mockingbirds. I love 2 of them in the deck. The 3rd and 4th copies, half the time you're sitting there like, I guess you're a 1/1 flyer that taps for Knight Errant. Okay. So, no, 2 has felt perfect. I really like where that list is.
Yeah.
But I'm going to go ahead and move over to mine real quick. Mono White Control. All right, folks. Now, we had a build similar to this that was smashing Dimir Aggro at I think it was an 80% win rate on the draw in testing prior to GP Atlanta, and I was this close to pulling the trigger and taking it to Atlanta, but all those Gruul Aggro decks that extended their reach with Questing Druid were a problem, and we didn't really have time to solve it, so we pivoted, right? However, this is the revised build. Now, what I like about this, the initial build had the Dust Animuses in the main, it had Sanguine Evangelists in the main. Those were very efficient at keeping Dimir out, but we were missing Wrath effects, and we were missing some of the pieces that this one has. I think this build acknowledges that base is great against red, Overlord's great against Dimir. Virtue of Loyalty is good against both as a single copy that allows you to just basically give your creatures vigilance and scaling, but you don't really want a bunch of copies of this unless you're expecting mirrors all day in mono white hell, right? And if you're in the draw bracket, maybe you get there, but otherwise you shouldn't be. The split ups to me are the biggest improvement I got to make. Being able to say we have a 3-mana Wrath so that if the opponent overextends with red and all those hasty creatures, we just blow them back out and force them to rebuild over a couple of turns, and oops, here's a Beza. Like, it does a really good job of stutter stepping the opponent so that you get the value train going, which is what this deck is all about. So I love where this is right now. I need to do a lot more testing with it, but I'd recommend it moving forward into this weekend.
What I love about mono white is the longer the match goes, out of all the decks that are control based, combo based, ramp based, it really does the job of winning the grind. More than those, the longer the match goes, the more likely mono white control is to win. But that's why I love this archetype, definitely. But I just have to say, overall, Standard feels like it's in a great place. There's a wide variety of game plans that have really had a chance to shine in Standard, and we felt that during Spotlight. Now, while Dimir and Red are still the ones with targets on their back, don't really count out the next wave of meta decks that are coming. And we'll definitely be back next time to analyze those decks.
On a final note, it was amazing. We got to see all these Rebels at Spotlight Atlanta this past weekend. Many of you stopped by. You said hi to me, said hi to Max. It was wonderful to meet all of you. Community for us has been an emphasis as we've grown, and we loved connecting with all of you, even if it was only a moment here to exchange thoughts and ideas or a moment there as we shared a meal. So please, like, share, comment on this video to show support for your community. We appreciate having you all here, and until next time, untap, upkeep,
Resist.